Good? Cool. Oh man, double mic.
So Andrea Ledesma is a master's student in the Public Humanities program at Brown University. She studies the intersections of public history, new media, and digital humanities. Is a graduate fellow for the Instructional Technology Group at Brown. A digital public humanist, she's committed to exploring how technology reinvents the ways in which museums and cultural institutions interpret and share cultural heritage.
Thanks, everyone. So I'll get started. So last November, a group calling themselves the Americans for the Better Way targeted the Masjid Al-Karim Islamic Center in Providence, Rhode Island. In a letter, they denigrated Muslims and warned them to, quote, pack their bags and get out of Dodge. This incident is one of thousands in a flood of hate that followed the 2016 presidential election. Activists and allies fortunately responded to the surge in kind, providing support and solidarity. Providence Mayor George Elizora, for example, launched a 24/7 hate crime hotline, and in California, the Asian Americans Advancing Justice Group recently launched Stand Against Hatred, the first ever tracker of hate crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the U.S. Works like these make hate visible through careful public documentation, and so they stand at this nexus of social justice and the digital humanities. In their essay, Putting the Human Back in the Digital Humanities, Feminism, Generosity, and Mess, scholars Elizabeth Losh, Jacqueline Wernemont, Laura Wexler, and Hong An Wu observe that, quote, activities to create digital collections around related acts of witness are central to digital humanities work. The data we collect and the archive we keep weigh heavily on public memory. So with this in mind, I invite us to interrogate the methodologies and consequences of bearing witness. In this presentation, I will specifically explore the history of hate crimes in the US through the 1990s, emphasizing how the anti-hate movement mobilized data at the risk of perpetuating bias. I then bring us back into the present to assess projects working with data to document the contemporary dialogue of hate crimes. We'll look at three projects: ProPublica's Documenting Hate, Grinnell College's Mapping Islamophobia, and Northeastern University's emerging project, Witnessing Hate. With these case studies, I aim to develop a better understanding of what it means to bear witness in a time when hate has become so painfully ubiquitous. So using this data-driven perspective to assess history and the now, I hope that together we can ponder, what does it take to translate the structural complexities of American life into sustainable, accessible data? What are the stakes of this legibility? And perhaps most importantly, how does this data support and center our most vulnerable citizens? So the history of hate crime legislation reveals this relationship between data collection and definition. In the 2014 edition of the Journal of Digital Humanities, Michael J. Kramer identified the long-running inquiry into the power of representation, particularly of the state's use of record-keeping to govern citizens. So I'd like to continue this inquiry through the anti-hate movement. How they collected and encoded data in service of the marginalized resonates with the ways in which we design archives that live online and beyond the state. American Studies scholar Christina B. Hanhart researched the emergence of the anti-hate movement in her book, Safe Space, Gay Neighborhood History and the Politics of Violence. One of the early milestones to this movement came in 1990 with the passage of the Hate Crime Statistics Act, the HCSA. This mandated the collection of data about crimes that manifest evidence of prejudice, and so by aggregating data, the HCSA would raise awareness of hate crimes nationally, improve law enforcement's response to hate crimes, and encourage the victims of hate crimes to come forward. But it is also important to highlight how the HCSA amplified earlier calls for visibility. In the 1980s, the Anti-Violence Project acknowledged how anti-gay violence had not yet been documented nationally. So with data and statistical analysis, activists depicted the discrimination faced by marginalized and or underrepresented communities in a form familiar to those with the power to protect them. While the HCSA facilitated the passage of legislation, its ambitious scope also proved to be one of its principal weaknesses. Hanhart critiques the Act's flawed reliance on data, writing, the conception of evidence related to hate crimes increasingly narrowed as the language of legislation shifted from mandating the collection of information to that of more systemized data. This can be blamed in part on the infrastructure of the HCSA. For one, the Act initially excluded demographics like gender and gender identity from its purview. Legal scholar Elizabeth A. Pendo implored as early as 1994 that, quote, excluding these instances from the data constituted an act of erasure, symptomatic of the same social pathology that encourages and tolerates violence. Collection methods also turned otherwise complicated notions of prejudice and victimization into discrete, identifiable sources. A single checkmark obfuscated the complexities inherent to hate. Activists were equally culpable, as groups ignored reports contrary to their agenda. Consider a 1991 memo from the Gay and Lesbian Action Council of Minneapolis to the Anti-Violence Project. The author recalled a well-known incident wherein a Black transgender woman was harassed by police officers, but concluded that the case was probably not appropriate for their report. In 1988, Kevin Berrill, former director of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, asked, "Where does the hate and hate crime come from?" The anti-hate movement attempted to characterize this phenomenon, and data was essential to their success, but the metadata proved more problematic. As editor of Raw Data as an Oxymoron, Lisa Gittleman wrote, "The imagination of data is in some measure always an act of classification. Once in place, these schemes are notoriously difficult to discern and analyze." The infrastructure of hate crime data rendered its biases invisible and indispensable. We can applaud the anti-hate movement and the HCSA for its advocacy, but their adherence to discrete characteristics and specific agendas ultimately complicated the more nuanced and arguably more authentic ways in which race, gender, class, sexuality, and the like intersect within individuals and communities. So the U.S. still clearly wrestles with the roots and consequences of hate, but I don't mean for us to dwell on the violence and prejudice that bombard us daily. Instead, I'd like to highlight and assess projects bearing witness to hate by aggregating data. These projects range in scope and scale, but all are still a testament to how data that respects narrative serves as a platform for resistance. So let's start with ProPublica's Documenting Hate. It is by far one of the most publicized projects collecting hate crime data today. ProPublica launched it as a database in 2016 with a diverse network of collaborators, including the Southern Poverty Law Center and the New York Times. Together, they aim to help local policymakers and law enforcement understand the problem of hate. And in many ways, Documenting Hate speaks to the legacy of the HCSA. The site recognizes the historical shortage of hate crime data. Again, as effective as these initial data sets were, Documenting Hate's database expands and evolves, knowing that the demand for more accurate and inclusive information is more urgent than ever. Documenting Hate also relies on more creative approaches to collecting data. In addition to reviewing law enforcement documents and news reports, the site prioritizes self-reporting. A portion of the online form seen here asks for the date, location, and nature of assault, as well as any photos, videos, or other related documents and attachments. Note that there's also an open text field that allows users to author their own narrative. The database encrypts all this information and manages permissions across partners. This method has proven successful, if not a little tricky. Scott Klein and Ken Schwennicke, the deputy managing editor and news application developer for ProPublica, admitted, "We get victims and eyewitness reports, which are very useful, as well as hearsay, social media quotes, and news stories, which are less so, and frankly, some trolls. But one of the things we've learned is that the best path is not to discourage people from coming forward, and to filter when we actually start using the data." So that said, Documenting Hate continuously engages the public with this information. Consider the affiliated New York Times series, This Week in Hate, which profiles episodes of hate speech and violence, adding personal dimension not only to the initial site of trauma, but also to the episodes of strength that follow. Works like this enliven the data and ultimately make it hard for others to ignore it. So altogether, Documenting Hate seems to have found a balance between data and narrative, embracing the messiness that comes with the latter. Klein and Schwennicke even both described working with data as dirty. Still, their commitment to judicious research, self-reporting, and flexible systems distinguish Documenting Hate as an initiative which respects both content and context. So next, we can consider Mapping Islamophobia from Grinnell College. This, as the name suggests, maps incidents of Islamophobia across the US between 2001 and 2016. For example, here, users can toggle between points characterized as attacks against property versus those of free speech and the like. Mapping Islamophobia is also accessible, so users can download the dataset behind these maps directly from the website. It comes as a CSV file and it's updated as the research grows. And nonetheless, the project still prioritizes its visualizations. Its maps, as they write, empower viewers to develop their own understanding of Islamophobia. What I'd like to distinguish about this project, though, is its historical methodology. Caleb Ethelbein, Associate Professor of History and Religious Studies at Berrill and the editor of Mapping Islamophobia, explained, "Part of a historical perspective is to show that American Muslim communities have been experiencing this for quite some time. So the project bears witness by looking back. It works through the materials of the past to articulate how hate affects the ways in which Muslim Americans participate in public life today. As much as we're alarmed by current events and fight against the normalization of hate, it's necessary that we also hold the present in context. The US has always reckoned with hate. We can see it in the data. When we bring projects as current as documenting hate together with the research of mapping Islamophobia, then we can draw this timeline in full. It is a longer, more complicated, and possibly more authentic narrative of American violence. And finally, I'd like to turn to witnessing hate, and this is the emerging project from Northeastern University's new lab for text, maps, and networks. Witnessing Hate will be a digital archive of materials related to contemporary hate speech and violence. The project draws inspiration from Our Marathon, the crowdsourced digital archive and memorial to the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings. Witnessing Hate will prioritize collaboration, so this means establishing a network of local partners and directly soliciting submissions from those in the Boston and New England area. At the same time, it will labor to both represent and support its users. Through a partnership with Northeastern's Law Library, the site aims to also provide individuals with resources emphasizing restorative justice. But witnessing hate is a work in progress. It still lends a powerful voice to this ongoing dialogue between data and memory. Most notably, the project comments on this renewed emphasis on the archive. Brian Cordell, assistant professor of English at Northeastern and an architect to Witnessing Hate, explains, if you're someone who works with the archive and you're seeing a moment that you recognize is going to be historically meaningful, there's a desire to do better, to be proactive and to save things before it slips through the cracks of history. Data, after all, speaks in aggregate. Collected and cataloged, the data under the care of Witnessing Hate and its peer projects have power. And so Witnessing Hate sits carefully between this pragmatic database and a historical archive. It sees the urgency, this very real need to collect events as they unfold, especially in the face of an administration that stands to ignore these experiences or at worst erase them entirely from public memory. But Witnessing Hate will not only serve as a comprehensive acquisitional archive. Instead, it will focus on what Cordell framed as longitudinal storytelling. He said, you have a different set of priorities when you're trying to imagine that scholar 50 years in the future. Elika Ortega, assistant professor of culture, societies, and global studies at Northeastern, also works with this project and echoed the sentiment. She defined testimony as a means of looking into the future and asked, who knows what kind of stories we'll need to understand what happened? And both envision Witnessing Hate as a space for empathetic storytelling, a space for historical documents, as well as the voices and people at their core. So the archive does not end here. There is a much richer library of works using data to bear witness. At least with documenting hate, mapping Islamophobia, and witnessing hate, we can better see how digital initiatives craft a distinct perspective on and build an individual capacity for documentation. Indexed and mapped, accessible and collaborative, these works showcase how data can lead users to not only witness, but remember and organize. So following the November attacks on the Masjid Al-Qureem Center, Rhode Island Jewish and Christian leaders issued a joint statement. We walk with you into the days to come, they wrote, whatever they may bring, nourished by our common faith and hope in the future. So to envision this future, I encouraged us to look into the past. The anti-hate movement relied on data to bring awareness and protection to victims of prejudice. Unfortunately, this data was not without its fault. It was systematic and effective, but it ultimately clouded the intersectionality ingrained into individual and communal experience. Renewed interest in the documentation and distribution of hate has created fascinating intersections with the digital humanities. With documenting hate, mapping Islamophobia, and witnessing hate, we followed this discourse between archive and narrative and can appreciate how individuals use the power of data and the web to bear witness. But of course, these projects continue to grow. Grinnell College is planning a complementary archive of the ways American Muslims continue to come together and push back. Witnessing Hate, of course, is still working to secure funding and establish a team of researchers. What we can extract now, though, is that data in the service of social justice does more than bring awareness to victimization. It carries the potential to amplify resilience. And Audre Lorde once wrote, I am constantly being encouraged to pluck some one aspect of myself and present this as a meaningful whole, eclipsing or denying the other parts of myself. So then let's strive for data that doesn't sacrifice authenticity for the sake of political and archival legibility. Again, let's strive for data that is messy. There are parts of ourselves and our experience that defy reification. We must ask what the narrative demands of data and how the two intersect. How are these intersections digitized, archived, and circulated respectfully? In our capacity as digital humanities practitioners and citizens living in extraordinary times, I'm confident that we can navigate the reorientation of the human experience in digital contexts. Our collaborators are more than victims. We are more than their scars, and we are more than the weight of our data. To bear witness means to be vigilant and compassionate, honest and accessible, and above all, human. Thank you.